This is it. You've done it. You're all caught up on the story, you reached max level, and you're all ready to dive into that sweet, sweet end game. But there's only one problem. Your gear sucks. Well, dear friend, don't worry, because upgrading your gear in Final Fantasy XIV is much easier than you might think. Let's start with a brief overview of what Endgame actually looks like. This is going to be an extremely dumbed down version of the massive amounts of things that you can do in this game, but for the sake of brevity and a focus on getting the best gear possible, let's take a look. Doing a daily expert roulette is a great way to farm tomestones, the most common in-game currency. The dungeons in expert roulette are always composed of the 2 or 3 most recent dungeons that have been released, so you must be completely up to date on the story in order to access it. Since the dungeons the roulette chooses from are all still relatively new, the gear that drops in these dungeons serve as a decent way in their own right to get your item level high enough to access the basic raids and trials. Plus, the tomestones you get for completing the roulette can be saved up in order to get even better gear down the line. The second piece of endgame content I'd mention are trials. If you're at max level, you've already beaten many trials in order to get to where you are in the story. The way the trials work at endgame is that they always have a story version of that trial that, while sometimes tricky, is relatively easy for the average player to clear. This allows players to experience the storyline associated with that trial without having to dive into extra challenging content if they don't want to. But the only reward from these story versions are a few tomestones. Once you beat the story version, however, a new extreme version of the trial becomes available to you. While more difficult to clear, these extreme trials often sport more than decent weapons or accessories. These are never going to drop the very best item level weapon or accessory available, unless you're at the very beginning of an expansion, but they do serve as an excellent way to farm better gear for raid progression. The other reason to farm extreme trials are for the exclusive mounts that have a small chance of dropping from their respective trial: ponies in Realm Reborn, Burbs in Heavensward, doggos in Stormblood, and dragons in Shadowbringers. Now onto the main event, raiding. There are 2 different kinds of raids in Final Fantasy XIV, 24-mans and 8-mans. In this game, 24-man raids are completely optional side content that drop good, mid-tier gear. They have their own story and are accessible enough that most players can complete them, but difficult enough that you generally need to keep your wits about you while you do, or you'll spend most of it lying on the floor. They're great for gearing alts or catching up on your main class if you've taken a break from the game. The current 24-man is a collab with Nier, and man, it's fantastic. When you hear players talking about raiding in this game, though, they're usually referring to the 8-man raids. These raids generally have interesting stories that are sometimes adjacent in some way to the main story, or more often, completely unique. Just like with the trials, there's a normal version of the raid that can be completed relatively easily just by queuing for it. Unlike the normal trials, however, the normal raid does drop its own version of gear. Trading in the tokens you win from the normal raid can net you some pretty nice filler gear to buff you up for the harder version. Which brings us to the main event, Savage Raiding. Once you complete the story version of the 8-man raid, a new difficulty opens up to you. The Savage 8-man raids are the main piece of in-game content that more serious players can tackle. Clearing them gives you access to the best gear in the game as a general rule, and the weapon that drops from the last tier tends to hold the dominant spot as the best weapon you can get in the game until the next Savage tier. This makes clearing the 4th floor extremely desirable in its own right, on top of the bragging rights that come with it. The only piece of content that's harder than Savage Raiding is something called Ultimate Raiding. This content I won't be going into too much detail for because it's mostly for bragging rights and the glam of the weapon that you get from defeating it. It's not so much to gear your character, it's really just to provide that extra level of strategy and difficulty for players that have already completed any given Savage tier. Now that you have a general idea of what content and gear is available, let's talk about how it all works together. As I mentioned earlier, Final Fantasy XIV's most common in-game currency is something called a tomestone. There are always 3 types of tomestones, elegant tomestones of poetics being the first, and the other 2 cycling in and out with new content. We'll talk more about poetics in my video about gearing while you're leveling, but the TLDR is that you can use them to get gear at level 50, level 60, and level 70, aka the previous expansion level caps. Keep those in mind when you're leveling your alt classes. But in this video, we care much more about the other 2. Each new major raid patch introduces a new form of tomestone to collect, but again, the basic formula stays the same. Take the current patch for example. Tomestones of Revelation is the most recent Tomestone to be introduced. It gives you access to the second best gear you can get in the game right now, trumped only by the drops obtained in Savage Raiding. Since the gear is so good, this particular currency is much more limited. Not only do you get less of it when running Expert Roulette and other in-game content, you can only get up to 450 of it each week, making it very important to try to cap this currency before the weekly reset. In addition, there is a way to augment this gear using tokens that drop from Savage Raiding. Augmenting the gear brings it up to the same item level as the gear that drops in Savage. Therefore, a class's best in slot gear in a raid patch is generally a combination of upgrading Tomestone gear and raid gear, since both are, at least initially, only accessible from clearing the raid. The other type of Tomestone in this current patch cycle are the Tomestones of Allegory. Before 5.4 dropped, this was the Tomestone that had a weekly cap of 450. With the introduction of Revelation, they did what the community calls uncapping the currency. Now, you can earn as many Tomestones of Allegory as you want in any given week. You just can't hold more than 2,000 of them at a time. The item level of the gear you can buy with them is not going to be as good as the capped Tomestone gear's item level, but since it's so much easier to get, it's a fantastic way to get more accessible gear. Just like the capped Tomestone gear, there is a way to augment this gear as well, increasing its item level by 10 to match the previous raid tiers. You can still do this by running the previous raid tier, but you can also do it by running the more accessible 24-man raid. Because of this, 24-mans are always released after a tier of Savage raids. Not only do they drop this weekly token used to upgrade the Tomestone gear, they also drop their own gear. Just like with the capped Tomestones and Savage Raiding, you are initially limited on how much gear you can get from a 24-man. You can pick one piece of loot and win one weekly token to upgrade a piece of Tomestone gear, but as time goes on, these restrictions are lifted. Okay, the only other piece of gear I haven't mentioned at all is crafted gear. When a particular set of crafted gear is released, only the best geared crafters in the game can produce it. There's a golden window at the beginning of a new raid tier where crafted gear is the quickest way to get the best stats possible while you're working on clearing the raid, making it extremely desirable for competitive raiders. There's also a way to pentameld crafted gear. Melding materia onto your gear can net you a more than decent gain in secondary stats like critical hit or determination. Most standard raid gear can only hold 1 or 2 pieces of materia each, but with crafted gear, you're allowed to affix up to 5 pieces of the stuff, with a lower and lower chance of doing so with each success. It's a risky business, and one that can be quite profitable for those looking to make a pretty penny selling gear and materia on the market board with a new raid patch. So, now that I've filled your brain with all sorts of systems and gobbledygook, let's run through what you can expect to see in the flow of an average expansion. The new expansion, X.0, drops. They delay the raid for a few weeks to give players time to enjoy the story and get to endgame. In the meantime, they work on farming 2 extreme trials, one that drops weapons and one that drops accessories. There's only one set of Tomestone gear, it doesn't have a weekly cap, and so they'll farm those pieces at a quicker pace to help them clear the trials. These activities will give them a head start when they go into Savage for the first time a couple of weeks later. Then, the first Savage tier is dropped. The first capped Tomestone is introduced, providing gear better than the previously available Tomestone. Crafted gear is also released with Savage so that the crafters also get a chance to get to endgame and prepare the materials and gear they will need to make it for the raiders. Players begin their progress on the raid. As they start clearing the floors, they earn loot that either replaces their current gear or upgrades their current Tomestone gear. Each week of prog gets a little bit easier as players get better and better gear from clearing earlier floors or collecting more weekly Tomestone gear. Okay, a few months go by, X.1 is introduced. By now, many raiders have successfully cleared the current tier, and others are very close. The first 24-man raid is introduced. Now, players can get a weekly token that they can use to upgrade their Tomestone gear without having to run the Savage raid. They can also get the same item level gear as the unaugmented Tomestone gear, creating a fake best in slot composed of unupgraded Tomestone gear and the 24-man raid gear instead of the Savage gear. Savage gear is still on top, but the new systems make it significantly easier to get the stats you might need for that last DPS check or catch you up quicker for the next raid tier if you skipped the current one. There's also a new extreme trial that gets introduced in this cycle to give you a mid-tier weapon upgrade if you haven't cleared the last floor yet. A few more months go by, X.2 drops. This brings the second tier of the Savage raid. The weekly lockouts from the 24-man and the old Tomestone is uncapped, making it even easier to catch up on gear to get to where you need to be. A brand new Tomestone is introduced, and now this one has a weekly limit. There's a new trial to clear when you aren't raiding, which will net you a slightly better weapon than last raid tiers. Starting to get the idea? X.3 brings the new 24-man, and it gives you even more mid-tier gear. X.4 brings the third and final tier of Savage rating. Then we start to get to the end of the cycle and we start it all over again.